Hi, everybody. Welcome to another HeartMind Happy Hour. I am your host, Holly Copeland, human potential coach, and one of the co-founders of the HeartMind Alchemy Lab community, along with Randy Knudsen and Stephen Altair, and really excited to have back on the show Dr. Michael Smith. Welcome, Dr. Smith.
Yeah, thanks for having me back on.
Absolutely. Dr. Smith is a naturopathic doctor in the Chicago region and board certified in biofeedback, and a wonderful person to have on the show to talk about HRV. There's been a lot of discussion and conversation and sharing of HRV metrics recently. And he actually reached out to me noticing all this conversation and talk about it. And he observed that there seemed to be some confusion about these metrics. And he wanted to come on the show to clear that up. And I really appreciate his offer. It's one of the things that I certainly feel like I'm always learning about and trying to understand more. It's not necessarily super easy. It can get kind of technical and complicated, and the fact that he offered and is kind of our resident expert on biofeedback and HRV in particular, I'm really grateful. And I also think it's especially topical because I'm just seeing HRV coming up a lot. It's an incredibly valuable tool for performance, whether you're a sports performance, and that's your goal. Certainly a lot of people are using it in that realm. And then also on the stress and anxiety management. And is there a little stress and anxiety out there right now? It seems like in the coaching world, I'm talking to people about stress every single day, and I bet Dr. Smith is too. And HRV, from my own personal experience, I've actually been finally gotten on the bandwagon of tracking it every single morning. And I'll share later as we get into it, some really interesting results that I've seen in my own tracking of it. So I'm really excited about this metric, to dive in more, to learn more about it, and have Dr. Smith particularly kind of set the record straight for us on how to use it. He's also offered to do a sort of do-it-yourself resonance frequency, kind of lead us through that, a little bit of a tutorial on that. It's something that I've wanted to do for a while and haven't quite figured out. So I'm really grateful that he's going to talk about that this hour too. So welcome back to the show. Thank you so much. And really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today, Dr. Smith.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me again. I want to echo what you said in that it is, or it can be, very complex and challenging to understand some of these deeper metrics and how we measure them. And so for that reason, I made some notes here to keep myself on task so I don't go off on tangents. So if you catch me looking over here, that's what I'm doing. And I thought that I would just jump right in talking about time domain measurement. So there's two groups or categories of measurements. There are the time domains, and then there's the frequency domains. And the time domains are used to calculate the amount of variability in the heart rate. It's the easiest heart rate variability measurement to calculate because it's based on statistical formulas that are standardized. So it makes the measurements very easy to compare across studies. As long as the durations of the measurements are the same and the length of recording times are under the same conditions. To record it, we need a continuous ECG. So for most of you, that's going to be a polar heart rate strap, or we'll talk about the camera phones a little bit later to obtain those interbeat intervals. So there's the QRS complex, that ventricular beat of the heart rate, and we're measuring the time between that heartbeat and then the next heartbeat. So the time in milliseconds between adjacent heartbeats, that's what we're measuring. The greater the variability in that RR interval, the greater the parasympathetic nervous system activity. Now, the sample rate is important. It's recommended to have at least a sample rate of 256 hertz or samples per second to accurately detect the RR spikes. I think that Polar does, and I'm not 100% sure on this, I would need to look it up, but I think that it's above that. I know that the camera phones are about 180 hertz. So it's still an accurate measurement and representation. Okay, so the first one is, the first time domain measurement is SDNN. So Holly, you've probably seen this one on Elite HRV. SDNN is the standard deviation of all the normal N-to-N intervals, or RR intervals. So it throws out any of the extraneous or ectopic beats. Those are removed from the data set. In this measurement, SDNN is best measured over a 24-hour period. There's some research that indicates 30-minute readings can roughly approximate a 24-hour reading, but this metric is very easily impacted by artifact. And so that's why long-term readings, long-term measurements are much more accurate. Now, the way that we think about SDNN is that it is impacted by both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. They both contribute to SDNN measurement. And so the way that I kind of tell my patients to think about SDNN is it's the balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Now, low SDNN, if we talk about just some of the research, has been shown to predict mortality, both ischemic and non-ischemic cardiac etiologies. So in larger scale multi-center studies, it's been shown, especially in those cardiac patients, that people with SDNN below 50 milliseconds have a 5.5 times greater mortality than those with SDNNs above 100 milliseconds. And so it's, in the literature, it's been shown to be one of the strongest univariate predictors of mortality. And it's remained the most powerful predictor of mortality even after adjustments for some of the other factors such as demographics, Holter monitor features, and even ejection fractions.
Can I interrupt you with a kind of, what maybe it's an odd question, but so when you're talking about mortality in this case, are you talking about dead people? Are you actually talking about?
Talking about death, yes.
That it actually predicts like your likelihood for, like, you have a shorter lifespan if you have a poorer number in this case.
Yes,
Okay.
Yeah, so yeah, one of the best predictors for not just, the most robust research is certainly in the cardiac etiologies, but all-cause mortality, so cause from anything causing, yeah.
Okay, yeah, sorry, that probably came out really odd, but I was just trying to understand like what.
It's a good question. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So when we think about that decrease in SDNN, that's due to an increase in sympathetic nervous system tone, so the fight or flight system, and then vagal withdrawal. Vagal withdrawal meaning the vagus nerve, so that parasympathetic action. Mm-hmm. That increases the risk for that ventricular fibrillation.
Got it.
So overall, in those 24-hour studies, SDNN above 100 milliseconds, we think of that as a healthy person. SDNN between 50 and 100, that is somewhat compromised health, and then SDNN below 50 would be in that category of unhealthy, something to be concerned about potentially. Now, there's multiple other variants of SDNN. We don't use those in biofeedback. They are used in cardiology, things like SDRR, SDANN, SDNN index, and especially the SDNN index, and SDHR are all different metrics, or like I said, variants of the SDNN. So 24-hour, other 24-hour metrics, which is different from RMSSD. RMSSD is the root mean squared of successive differences. This is less impacted by artifacts, so it's a much more reliable and accurate calculation of variability. It tells us about the state of the parasympathetic nervous system because it's mediated by parasympathetic activity. So I tell my patients to think about this as parasympathetic tone. How strong is their parasympathetic nervous system? And in the literature, this has been shown to be a significant indicator of atrial fibrillation and unexplained death in epilepsy, actually. But this is the best short-term measurement. So a 5-minute measurement will give a good estimation of RMSSD. There are some other short-term measurements that are reliable that we do use. Probably the one that's in the literature out of all these next 3 or 4 that I'm going to say is the natural log of RMSD, and that's just exactly what it is. It just puts it into a better statistical number. So it's just the natural log of RMSSD. And then there's NN50. This is the number of actual adjacent NN intervals that differ from each other by 50 milliseconds, by greater than 50 milliseconds. And then there's the percentage of that. So there's P NN50, and that's the percentage of the differences between the successive NN intervals that differ from each other by greater than 50 milliseconds. And when we're training, when we're doing resonant frequency biofeedback, we want to see this typically above 50%. And then there's also, and this is probably the last one, I mean, there's other time domain measurements, but this is the last one that I'll talk about because these are the ones that we use in biofeedback. And that's the heart rate max, or NN max, and NN min, which I believe is on Elite HRV. And that's just a simple, kind of quick and dirty way to estimate variability in beats per breath cycle. I think that's all that I want to say about time domain measurements. Any questions with that?
Yeah, that's really helpful to go over it. And you said you were going to offer to have a cheat sheet for us that you're going to put together.
Yeah, right? Yeah, I want to put together just a quick little cheat sheet. But I haven't done it yet. So in its place though, if you, here, let me share this in the chat for everybody. This is
great. So I will
study.
see if I can post this to the actual.
Yeah, this is a great paper that was done in the past couple of years by Fred Schaefer, one of the fathers kind of in the HRV biofeedback world. So it's an overview of heart rate variability metrics and norms, and mostly the metrics. There, as we'll talk about, there's not a whole lot of norms when it comes to heart rate variability population-wide. It's a very individual metric. SDNN is the only one actually that I think that he talks about as far as norms in this paper, because it's really the only one that we have that can go across populations.
I just posted it into the chat, into the comments actually on the live posts. So people who are there can go look at it right now. Yeah, it's great to have that overview of the time domains because I have seen them in elite HRV, but not understood exactly how they might be used. So
Yeah.
it's really helpful to see. So, um,
Yeah, it's challenging with these apps because they give you a score
right,
and they really tell you what to do with that. And there's
right,
often, that speedometer showing you in what sympathetic dominant or in what nervous system dominance you're in, or if you're well balanced.
right.
Um, but it's important to um, talk about and look at these metrics so that you can more fully understand what it is that's actually going on there.
So I do have a question. So with the RMSSD score, which you talked about as being less impacted by artifacts and an indicator of parasympathetic tone. So when we think about parasympathetic tone, um, what is a good tone and what does that mean exactly? Does it mean that because parasympathetic is the rest and digest system, so it's your ability to kind of deal with stress, right? And
Yeah,
so, yeah, what does it mean to have a good tone?
that's a great question. Again, as far as a number, that's hard to say because that's individual for everybody. Now, there are some norms within certain populations, right? There's norms within, as far as data that we have for college age wrestlers, elite athletes. There's data for population age ranges in a certain part of Mexico, or so we have some data, some normal values in some populations. But for it to broadly go across the population is a challenge, except for the SDNN. So RMSSD, that one's more difficult, especially changing with age and gender and um, cardiovascular strength, resilience. A lot of things impact that. So it's important to get enough data and track it over time to see what your baseline is.
Mhm.
Because that's really what you're measuring. Is any deviation off of that baseline is your nervous system being more challenged. And so then we need to start to train recovery modalities. Um, did that answer your
Yeah.
question?
Yeah. So, I mean, I understand that getting a baseline could be important, but you could be somebody who comes in with a really low parasympathetic tone, right? Like if you had a very stressed client who just came in and, you know, they've got their anxieties running high, everything going on in the country is stressing them out, they feel vulnerable. Are they likely to have low parasympathetic tone?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
So someone who is an insomniac who has not been getting good quality sleep at night, someone who is chronically stressed all the time. Um, yeah, there's definitely certain populations that are going to come in and they're going to have a lower RMSSD.
Mhm.
What
Okay.
be their norm?
Yep.
Yeah.
And then so that is a indicator that just helps kind of, they may say, I'm feeling pretty stressed. Then you can look at that number and say, yeah, boy, we have a lot of room for improvement. I mean, to me, that's what
Yeah.
these numbers can on a personal level help with is like, it makes it real, right? It's not just me saying I feel stressed, but you can actually look at the number, compare yourself to the population or what a healthy number would be, and
Of
in
course.
fact
Yeah.
see that your body is in fact stressed.
Yeah. If I'm seeing a 25-year-old female who is super anxious and not getting great sleep, I would probably see that, and I would tell her that, based on your age and gender, where you're currently at, your nervous system is really challenged right now. It's really taxed.
Mhm.
Uh, but that number would be different if it was a 60-year-old male.
Got it. So you do have to baseline yourself against the relative population. And
Against the data that we do have, which
Mhm.
isn't very robust.
Okay. Hopefully that will change as more this is used more and more in the population.
The thing with the apps is that most of the people using these apps, I mean, they were created for mostly athletes. And so that's the majority of the population that's in there. Now, the age range is vast. It's pretty wide. But they still tend to be folks that are doing more physical activity, more exercise. And so their HRV is going to be higher just simply because their cardiovascular system is a little bit stronger.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah, that's helpful. But
because they do have those norms within a lot of the apps, like where do you fall?
Yeah.
Based on your age and gender compared to everybody else in the app.
Right. I noticed that because I looked this morning, for example, at that norms table when I looked at just the basic, my morning HRV score. And I was thinking as I looked at it, well, you don't necessarily want to be normal in this realm, right? You might want to actually be on the higher end of normal, depending on what statistic you're looking at. So those norms are a little bit of a tricky thing. It's almost more like these numbers, like what's compromised, what's healthy, are more relevant. But it totally depends on the sample population, of course, but.
Absolutely. And the biggest thing is your deviation from baseline. Now, you know, if it was someone who was concerned about, you know, whatever it may be, their diabetes, their cardiovascular health, then they should get a 24-hour measurement, a 24 or 48-hour measurement of HRV, or of all of the cardiac biometrics that they're going to look at. But certainly, but certainly a 24-hour measurement would be the thing for that particular person.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, I think that's good. You want to head into frequency domains?
Yeah, let me jump into frequency domains. So frequency domain measurements represent the amplitude of the heart rate fluctuations over time and express the absolute and relative power as a function of different frequencies. So we'll talk about all those different frequencies. And it's used to understand the underlying rhythms or patterns in the heart rate and the amount of power at each particular bandwidth. I don't think I'll say that. Let's jump right in. So the high frequency bandwidth is between 0.15 and 0.40. And this equates to rhythms that cycle between 2.5 to 7 seconds. In one cycle, or one period, sometimes what we call it, is just one sine wave rhythm, okay, in the heart rate. So when we're doing RSA, or resonant frequency breathing, that's one inhalation, one exhalation. High frequency is mediated by the vagus nerve innervation to the SA node of the heart, and it's associated with the parasympathetic nervous system, actually. The power distribution in the high frequency band reflects RSA. RSA is our respiratory sinus arrhythmia, which is our heart rate variability. So how much of that variability on the inhale as the heart rate goes up and on the exhale as the heart rate goes down. Reflects RSA when we're breathing at rates between, or I should say above 7.5 breaths per minute. So a higher breath per minute than when we would be training at a resonant frequency rate. Tends to be more pronounced at rest. So this is just unconscious restful breathing. We're not thinking about the breath. This should be us at rest. That's the high frequency bandwidth, okay? And those high frequency rhythms, because of that, are considered to be a measure of parasympathetic dominance. So just our resting autonomic state. It decreases with age, and that's due to a reduction in parasympathetic activity. So people with, cardiac pathologies, emotional distress, anxiety, panic, worry. They've been shown to have decrease in resting high frequency power spectrum. Now, if the vagus nerve was cut, so a vagal blockade, that would eliminate the oscillations of high frequency, and we'll talk about low frequency. It reduces low frequency power as well. Thus, again, a parasympathetic innervation there. So breathing at higher respiratory rates produces a more complex waveform. So there's going to be multiple frequencies in that bandwidth, but the high frequency is going to be higher at rest. So someone breathing, let's say at 12 breaths per minute, they can have several of those frequency peaks in their power spectral analysis. Very low frequency, high frequency, but at rest, the high frequency should be the highest peak. And high frequency correlates to RMSSD that we just talked about. So that's high frequency. And when we're training at low frequency. So when we're training resonant frequency breathing, we're training at a lower frequency, which we're going to talk about next. But as we continue to train at a low frequency, we're impacting those baroreceptors, which I'll talk about in a moment. And over time, let's say you're training at 5 breaths per minute for 5 weeks. Over the course of those 5 weeks, or at the end of it, let's say you started with 16 breaths per minute. Now, because you've been exercising those baroreceptors at that low frequency, your high frequency at rest should go higher, because now maybe you're breathing at 8, 10 breaths a minute instead of 16. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense to me. And I think what I heard you say, and tell me if this is correct, is that through low frequency training, you essentially, is it like you bring down your resting frequency? Like it's actually, it sounds like it comes down, but you said something about the high frequency going up. So that I'm a little bit confused on that. Something goes up and something goes down.
I knew that this was going to be the most complicated thing,
Yeah.
which is I was trying to keep it as simple as possible. But this is one thing that's important, so I did want to talk about it.
Yeah.
So we're going to be training at a low frequency rate. When we're training at that low frequency, we're going to be stimulating those baroreceptors, which are those pressure sensors, those stretch receptors. And over time, as we do that, we're oscillating all of those symptoms, and that's where the resonance is happening. It's the baroreceptors, the heart rate, the blood pressure, all of those things are starting to oscillate in that low frequency bandwidth. And so as we're exercising that system, that resonance system, over time, what happens is that now when I am at rest, I am going to have a lower resting respiratory rate.
Yeah.
So my respiratory rate is going to be lower at rest, but it's still not going to be my resonant frequency. It's not going to be 6 breaths a minute, but it will be lower. So maybe it'll be 8 or 10 or 12 breaths a minute. That is within the high frequency band. So high frequency is going to go higher at rest. And it should, if I'm appropriately training resonant frequency breathing.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I
Okay.
think I understand. That's very helpful that you're lowering your respiratory rate, but the high frequency actually ends up being higher. So, and that high frequency means that you've probably improved your parasympathetic tone by doing it?
Exactly. Yes, absolutely. So at rest, now you're in a more parasympathetic state.
Got it. Okay.
Yes.
So
Good.
yeah, so you're just naturally resting more.
Mm,
You're like your whole nervous system has calmed down in a resting state.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep. Good.
Okay.
So that's high frequency. So now low frequency, that's the bandwidth that occurs between 0.04 and 0.15 hertz. That equates to rhythms with periods that occur between 7 to 25 seconds. And the baroreceptors are what influence and generate this band. So that's what generates and influences the low frequency band is the baroreceptors. So it's called the baroreflex band. And it is connected to that respiratory sinus arrhythmia. And some research suggests that more than half of the power in the low frequency band results from cardiovascular resonance and the baroreceptor feedback loop system. And basic resonance of that system is roughly around 0.1 hertz. 0.1 hertz is a 10-second breath cycle, which would be 5 seconds in and 5 seconds out. So 6 breaths per minute would be 0.1 hertz, which is just the broad general recommendation for RF breathing.
Yeah. Okay. And is there, am I remembering correctly that there's some link between this resonant frequency breath and actually the like Schumann resonance, the resonance of the planet? There's this number is beyond significant for just human health, but has kind of other implications.
That's really interesting that you say that. I mean, I don't know that.
Okay.
I don't know that to be true. But I would speculate that yes, I mean it's oscillating several different systems of the body, and that's what resonance is. It's trying to basically sync up as many systems as possible and get them into the same frequency.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know, it makes sense to me. I wanted to, I'm very curious about experiments like grounding, for example.
Yep.
In Schumann resonance and getting the electrons from the earth and seeing if HRV just, inside versus outside bare feet would increase HRV. And my suspicion is that it might.
Yep. Yep. And I got for Christmas an Apollo device, which I've been using since I got it a couple weeks ago. And this is also known with its vibratory frequencies to improve HRV. At least I've seen that as people have been posting about that on the.
Yeah, I've seen that too. It looks interesting.
Yeah.
But I've not read any data on it yet. So, but yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I guess one thing that I have noticed is when I use PEMF with patients, which is pulsed electromagnetic frequency or fields,
Mm-hmm.
that are in that 0 to 60 hertz range, so that Schumann resonance range, that HRV definitely does increase in most patients.
Okay. Cool.
Okay, so we talked about this being baroreflex range. Okay.
And maybe we'll talk about this later, or we can talk about it now. But
Sure.
as you said, just because you said HRV increases with PEMF, but HRV, you don't necessarily just want it to be higher and higher necessarily, correct? Or do you? Because in my experiments with, or my personal use of Elite HRV, I noticed that if I had more stress on one day and I woke up, I actually would have a higher HRV, and it would tell me, oh, you're ready. I see that you're in recovery mode. Your readiness is lower. So there's a balance there, right? In those morning baseline scores.
Absolutely. So we don't want to be too sympathetic, right? We don't want to be too challenged, too stressed. We also don't want to be too parasympathetic. We don't want to be so exhausted, tired, napping that we don't do anything at all. So yes, there has to be a balance of the nervous system. And that's what we're training when we're training peak performance, is not one over the other. We should be slightly parasympathetic leaning, so slightly parasympathetic dominant in those moments, in those peak performance moments. But there should be a little activation of that sympathetic system as well, because that helps, it does help to focus us.
Mm-hmm. Right. It makes sense too, right? That it shows a level of readiness for your body for activity. And so to wake up with a bit of a higher HRV score is, I can see why they said in the app, they said, oh, your actually readiness is low. And so they were cueing in on that higher HRV to say, we can see your body's in recovery mode.
Right.
Which is actually, it was very interesting to see how well it picked it up. I felt a little tired, and I knew that the day before I had some things happen that I kind of thought might do that, but to actually see the score was really enlightening.
Yeah, that's what's so cool about it, is that, our heart, our nervous system tells the story before we even are consciously aware of it or feel it. So it's a really, really great tool in biometric to track, and non-invasive, right? It's easy to do. So
super easy.
Yeah, it's something you can do every single day.
Yeah. Yep.
So maybe just for a moment before I go into the very low frequency, I can talk about cardiovascular resonance and aligning those three basic oscillating systems: the heart rate, the blood pressure, and the baroreceptors. So when we inhale, heart rate's going to increase. 5 seconds later, our blood pressure is going to rise. Okay, and then the baroreceptors, they detect that rise, and they start to fire more rapidly. We exhale, heart rate decreases. 5 seconds later, blood pressure is going to fall. And in resonant frequency training, heart rate and blood pressure are oscillating at 180 degrees out of phase. So when one goes up, the other goes down, right? The baroreflex is the strongest at that time, and our RSA, respiratory sinus arrhythmia, is at its highest peak or greatest. And then heart rate and respiratory rate are in phase, so they're syncing up. They're right on top. They're right on top of each other. So they should be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
Great. Okay. Another one that you'll see is low frequency, high frequency ratio.
Mm-hmm.
This is an indication of autonomic balance, but only for long-term readings. So this is not a biofeedback measurement. We don't measure this during slow-paced breathing.
Okay.
So in the short term, it's considered a very poor estimation of autonomic balance, specifically because measuring this, it's often done in testing situations that increase sympathetic nervous system influences on that domain. So some papers suggest that 5 minutes is long enough to get a decent reading, but the longer 24-hour readings are required to get accurate data. Typically, a decrease in the LF-HF ratio indicates a state of parasympathetic dominance and baroreflex activity. And that is seen when we conserve our energy and we start to engage in tend and befriend behavior. And it increases, so an increase in LF-HF ratio indicates sympathetic dominance when we engage in that fight or flight system or fight or flight behavior. So you'll see when you're doing your resonant frequency breathing that this ratio is It could be 10, 20, 30 or more even. And so it's highly skewed by that RF resonance breathing. And so that's why we don't track it, we don't use it during biofeedback practice.
And so what is it most useful for, I guess?
It should be lower at rest. Like if we're
Okay.
not thinking about it, it should be much lower at rest
Okay.
than 10.
Okay.
So yeah, so it's more so used in the 24-hour readings.
Okay.
But like I said, it can there's some research papers that say a 5-minute reading can estimate that LF HF ratio, and we're looking at it kind of like SDNN, where it's autonomic balance. It's the balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic systems.
And so why would you use this ratio if you had SDNN, for example? What additional information does it provide?
Well, now 2 different things. You're talking about time domain and frequency domain measurements.
Yeah.
So remember, time domain is the amount of variability.
Right. Okay.
Amplitude of those heart rate fluctuations.
Okay.
And the power in those frequencies.
Okay.
So it's a different measurement.
Okay.
Now the next one is very low frequency. So VLF. This is a much slower bandwidth. So 0.0 to 0.04 hertz. So this occurs between every 20 seconds to every 5 minutes. So much lower frequency. It's very poorly understood, actually, and because it's such a low bandwidth, or slow bandwidth, I should say, the long-term readings, the 24-hour readings, are needed for an accurate representation. So again, this is not something that we use in biofeedback training. And because, again, it's not poorly understood, there's speculation around what generates these waves. Some suggest they're generated intrinsically, actually, by the heart. Circadian rhythms, thermal and hormonal regulation, basic metabolic rate, and that it represents the amount of power displayed by the sympathetic nervous system trying to control the heart rhythm at the SA node. So it could indicate too much sympathetic arousal. So it's thought perhaps to be mediated by the sympathetic nervous system and related to, again, that thermal regulation and gastrointestinal regulation. Now it increases at night. We know that it increases at night and it peaks before waking. So that's the thought behind potentially the circadian rhythms and the hormone regulation factoring into it. Now, when we block the vagus nerve, we do that vagal blockade, it will completely terminate the bandwidth, while the sympathetic blockade, it does not. So it has been linked to and is associated with a lot of adverse outcomes. So, for example, it has been one of the metrics that we use along with SDNN and the next metric that I'll talk about, which is ultra low frequency, to predict those future adverse cardiac outcomes with all-cause mortality, and is associated with a host of other health-related issues, from increased inflammation, arrhythmic death, and PTSD. So again, it's this frequency bandwidth that's best monitored through a 24-hour recording, and short-term readings are just not predictive at all, really.
But if somebody wanted to put on a polar heart strap and do their own reading for 24 hours, they might be able to get a good VLF.
Yeah, just making sure that using some conductive gel, probably. so that there's an accurate signal throughout the whole day, and that they're not being too active, because with more movement, there's certainly going to be more artifact.
So you wouldn't go for a run with it on. You would like choose not to run that day.
Yeah.
Okay, so noted.
Okay, and then there's ultra low frequency,
Mhm.
which really doesn't get talked about at all, but it is, like I said, also one of those metrics that has this ability to predict these future adverse events. Because it is such a slow bandwidth, so 0.003 hertz, it absolutely demands a 24-hour reading. And you simply will not get enough data if you're trying a shorter term reading. So again, we don't use it for biofeedback. Again, it's very poorly understood. We don't know how it's generated or what influences it. We think that it's similar to the very low frequency, where the circadian rhythm, hormonal regulation. One thing that's different that we think is that the renin-angiotensin system, so that system that regulates blood pressure in our kidneys, may also be at play in the ultra low frequency band. And there's one thing that I wanted to say about it. I just saw a study recently. So it was the best prognostic indicator was SDNN, and we're talking about MIs, so we're talking about cardiovascular disease here. So SDNN and a metric called triangular index, which I think is similar to the SDNN index. Those were the two most predictive, and then right alongside it, SDNN was below 50 milliseconds, and this HRV triangular index below 15. But ultra low frequency and very ultra low frequency and very low frequency for the 24-hour spectral analysis did equally well. So all of these in combination, I think, are better at predicting these adverse cardiovascular outcomes. And
this is having, I'm presuming this is having more of these. Like if you have too many of these VLF or ULF, if the amplitude is higher on this, that is what's associated with these mortality events or inflammation or PTSD. Is that right?
correct, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
In this one study, SDNN below 50 milliseconds, not bad. It had a 67% sensitivity and 63% specificity in being able to predict MI, heart attack.
So somehow when you have this too much, do we know what causes these very low frequency or ultra low frequency waves to fire? Like what is it about inflammation that is?
Like I said, we don't really. We think that it may be intrinsically generated intrinsically by the heart, so mediated in some fashion intrinsically by the heart, maybe. There's a lot of things that are thrown out there. So
Yeah, I could the
hormonal regulation,
yeah.
our metabolism, that just basal metabolic rate, renin-angiotensin system. It's right now there's a lot of things implicated, and we really don't know.
But basically, am I correct in saying that the electrical signals are kind of slowed down, right?
Think about that. Would the electrical signals be slowed down?
Just they're lower frequency waves, so they're slower. So isn't the implication of that the electrical signals are slowed? like the system.
I don't know that I would make that.
Okay. Okay. Well, we'll stop the random hypothesizing and move on. something to read about in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So that's the time domains and the frequency domains.
Helpful.
Yes, I hope that that was helpful. I just wanted to outline the things that are short term, that we do use, that we can use, and those things that are more long term, that we really don't have a great understanding about, or that we
Yeah.
should not be.
Yeah.
Feedback. Okay, let's talk about resonant frequency assessment.
Great. Yeah, let's.
So the whole reason why we're doing an RF assessment is because we're trying to get that person to breathe at their optimal breath rate. And when I say optimal breath rate, I mean the breath rate at which they have the highest amplitude oscillations of their heart rate variability. So this is their maximum variability, and this is their lowest variability. So what's the maximum at that particular breath rate? So for most people, I'll start somewhere between 7 or 6.5 breaths per minute. And then over the course of maybe 15 minutes, we'll slowly decrease by a half second until we get down to about 4.5 breaths per minute. Once we get lower than that, we are starting to get into that very low frequency range. That's not quite where we want to be. We want to stay in that low frequency range. So doing this on your own at home, the best way to do it would be to have a heart rate strap, so an ECG that would be able to take a sampling rate of at least 256 hertz or higher, would be even more optimal. But also use your phone camera, and there are apps like Hrv biofeedback. Same guy, Marco Altini, that made the Hrv for training app, which is very similar to Elite Hrv. I like Elite Hrv better because it gives you all the metrics for free. You have to pay to get all of those other metrics if you want them on his web platform, which I'm sure it's not great. It's like $5 to $15 a month. But I bring that up because the Hrv for biofeedback app, he actually has a resonant frequency assessment built into it.
Cool.
And so there's different ways to do it, but the way that the app does it is it switches up the breath rates. It doesn't go consecutively from 6.5 to 6 to 5.5 to 5. It switches them up and puts them all over the place. So you're doing 7, and then you're doing 4.5, and then you're doing 6, and then you're doing 5.5. So it kind of bounces around. And we use that too, and I'll talk about the benefits of that. But that's the way that app does it. And I want to say that it's about a 10-minute, maybe 12-minute assessment of the different breath rates. So you're doing one breath rate for a couple of minutes, maybe a minute and a half, and then you're doing the next breath rate and the next breath rate and the next breath rate. And at the end, it calculates all the data and it estimates your resonant frequency.
Nice. And that's Elite Hrv doesn't have that, if I'm not mistaken, right?
No. Yeah. So Marco Altini was awesome. He probably understands Hrv research as good as anybody, better than most. And he's developed some really neat apps because he understands the research so well. And that's one of them. Yeah.
Okay.
I do think that it is fairly accurate. like I said, the only limitation is that this is 180 hertz, so samples per second.
Okay.
This is an ECG. Now, he's done studies on his own where he says that they are very comparable. Go back and look at the exact numbers. I want to say that it was something like 20 to 30% of a difference. But anyways, if so, that's one option. The other option would be to use the heart rate strap. And if you're doing that with, let's say, Elite HRV, where you can do the open readings, the first thing that I would do as far as setup for resonant frequency assessment, making sure that you are in a restful state to begin with, right? You want to avoid working out 2 hours beforehand, taking your medication supplements right beforehand, drinking a big glass of water beforehand. All these things are going to quickly change your heart rate variability. So just making sure that you're rested and sat down in the spot where you're going to do the assessment for a few minutes before you actually start is a good idea. The next thing is pacing yourself for the first 5 minutes. So that first 5 minutes, a little bit of a buffer to kind of get your heart in that rhythm, in sync, and then starting with, let's just say 6.5 breaths per minute. And you would breathe at 6.5 breaths a minute for 2 minutes. So that would be your first recording. Your first recording would be those 2 minutes.
Okay.
And then you stop it. Continue to keep pacing now at 6 breaths a minute. And then when you're ready, start the recording. And you're going to breathe at 6 breaths a minute for the next 2 minutes.
And so on.
And so on down to 4.5, yes.
Got it. Okay.
To confirm the resonant frequency, because we always want to confirm that resonant frequency, because, user error, or just if you haven't been practicing regularly enough yet, you want to make sure that you've been practicing for at least a few weeks before you do an RF assessment.
Okay.
Consistently. Maybe just at 6 breaths per minute, just the regular recommendation of 5 in, 5 out. And then about a week later, I would redo the assessment, but that's when I would switch up the breath rates. So that's when I would, now maybe you start at 5 breaths a minute, and then you go to 6, and then you go to 4.5, and then 5.5.
And why is that important?
Is I think that it really solidifies what that resonant frequency is. If we switch up those breath rates, because sometimes when we go in a sequential order like that, you're simply just going to get better at it.
Oh, yeah.
And so you might get a little bit more relaxed, and you might get more calm, and so variability is just going to increase anyways.
Yep. Got it. Makes sense. Okay.
So that's why switching it up is a good idea.
Okay. And so if you were doing the HRB for biofeedback app and using that, then probably still you would recommend you do it once and then do a couple weeks later and do it again, and maybe a couple weeks later and do it again, right?
Of course. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Now, typically, once you found your resonant frequency, that's it.
Okay.
It doesn't change a whole lot. I've had it change in some patients, but usually once you found your RF, that's your RF.
Okay.
That is your optimal breath rate at which you have the highest variability.
Okay. And just so it's really clear for people, if you were doing this home option and you were, let's say, using Elite HRV, so you were using their pacer, you take a recording, so you're getting the HRV score.
Do they have a pacer on Elite HRV?
What's that?
They have a pacer on Elite HRV?
They do.
Oh.
Yeah, there's actually a resonant breathing pacer.
Oh, okay. And you can change the seconds on
Yes.
there?
Yes, you can.
Nice. I like that they've updated that and built that into the app. If that wasn't in there, I'd recommend having a breathing app in the background, something like Breathe Plus or Awesome Breathing. That would be your pacer. Like it will still run in the background even if you have Elite HRV up on your screen.
Yeah. Yeah, but they do.
Cool.
So
Now, once you've got all that data, you're going to interpret it.
yeah.
You are interpreting a resonant frequency. When we're doing it in biofeedback, there's a lot of things that we're looking at. We're also looking at a sampling rate that is much, much higher, over 1,000. So it's very sophisticated equipment.
Yeah. And just so for people are understanding, so this is something that Dr. Smith does in his office with clients to get a very sophisticated version of this number. And what we're talking about right now is how you could do it yourself using the techniques he just outlined. But, it may be that for your purposes, you do want to go into a clinic like his and actually get these more detailed numbers, right? I just want to be painfully clear about the difference because it might not be obvious to people.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. We can get down to the 100th of a second of what your optimal breath rate is versus, these apps, it's going to be a second or at best a half second. Okay, so now on to the assessment. What are we looking at? And let me pull up, I'm going to share my screen and
I'm going to give you power to do that. Go for it.
Cool. Thank you. So this is a presentation I made a long time ago, and I pulled it up just because it had this, which is the old version of the Elite HRV app. It's black now.
Yep, quite updated now.
Yeah, but these are the time domain measurements, and then down here are the frequency domain measurements. And it'll provide you this when you finish your open reading. So it'll give you this chart, and this is at the top, right? Mm-hmm. And then it'll give you the signal quality. Now that's important. The signal quality, if I have more than 3 artifacts in 2 minutes, or even if I have more than 2, maybe, I would throw that data out and I would redo it.
Okay.
Really don't want any artifact in the signal. So I think it's important that I mention that.
Yeah.
And then when I come over here to the time domains, I'm going to be looking at RMSSD and SDNN. I want to see SDNN be very high. I want to see RMSSD be very high. And I'm looking at the mean RR interval. This is the average of the time between this heartbeat and the next. So 1,000 milliseconds, for example, would be 1 second between heartbeats. And so I'd be looking at those 3 metrics here. And at my resonant frequency, they should be the highest. And even more importantly, when I come down to the frequency domains, which I unfortunately,
maybe you're not on this presentation. Okay, so we'll envision.
Well, it will have your high frequency, your low frequency, your very low frequency, your LF-HF ratio, and the one that you're going to want to zoom in on and target is low frequency. Now, unfortunately, Elite HRV does not give you a percentage of the frequencies. And that's typically what I like to look at, because you're gonna look at this number and you're gonna go, okay, what does 10,000 mean?
Yeah,
it means nothing. So just taking the time to do that simple math and dividing the total from the low frequency and getting that low frequency percentage. We want that low frequency percentage to be as high as possible. At your resonant frequency, your low frequency should be 90 plus in most people. For some people, it might be in the, but it should be 90, 95, 98. It should be very, very high, that low frequency number. And so thus high frequency should be very low. And your total power, now this is not something that you have to look at, but your total power should probably also be the highest at your resonant frequency.
Okay. So the low frequency should be highest and the power should be highest.
The total overall power.
Okay.
Yeah. In that frequency domain.
Got it. I was just looking to see what they had, because I pulled up the app with my data on it just to look to see. And you said it's the percentage is the one that you don't think they have.
Yeah, when you're looking at high frequency and low frequency.
Yep.
Even total power frequency.
I just have the total power.
Yeah, they don't put a percentage on there. It's just a number.
Yeah, there is an LFAF ratio, which I know that that doesn't mean much in this.
Yeah, they have the ratio on there. But just like I said, just doing the math quick and the percentage so that way you can go on to the next one.
Yep.
And look at the breath rate and the next one and the next one. One metric that I forgot to mention, and I cannot believe it because it is one of the most important, and I'm glad that I'm seeing it now, is this 7-day Hrv Cv.
Okay.
Cv is the coefficient of variation. And basically, it is the variation of the variability in my heart rate from my baseline. So from my baseline over the past 7 days, this is how much variability there is in my variability. And it's an important number to look at. If that is too high, that is certainly a more challenged nervous system that needs to train more recovery. But it's not just if it's too high. We can't look at it in isolation. We have to look at it from, the last 3 days. Maybe it was, let's say it was 3% and it shot up to 11, like it is right there. That's a challenged nervous system. But same exact thing. Let's say that it's up at 15% and now it drops all the way down to 4%. That's still a significant amount of variation in my variability. Mm-hmm. And so that's concerning too. And so that would tell me the same thing. That would tell me that probably need to train more recovery.
Okay.
So yeah, so that's an important one to look at. And if I'm correct, I believe Elite HRV is probably one of the very few apps that actually has that metric on there.
They do. I just was looking at mine, so I can confirm that. It's pretty cool. Yep.
Very, very good app, or a good metric to look at. Yeah,
I love Elite HRV. I have to say, after using it for 10 days, it's pretty amazing what you get for. It's either a free app or it's not expensive.
I think it's free.
Yeah, I think so too. It's such an amazing app. It's so easy to do every morning. It's really a great app. I highly recommend it. I was going to ask you, do you know, let's see. So other sensors, you mentioned the chest strap and the phone, which Elite HRV does, but it also does the ear clip. Like I have one of the HeartMath ear clips. What do you think of those?
Yeah, so there's the ear clips, there are the Ppg Finger Sensors, Core Sense, I think, is a lead HRVs. Sometimes there's connectivity issues with it. The biggest thing is, as long as the sampling rate is high enough, like as long as there's an accurate measurement when it comes to the PPGs, so the ear attachment, basically want to make sure that the finger is completely covered, that there's no interference with any of the ambient light at all, so that it can get an accurate reading.
Yep.
And then, like I said, of course, just the sampling rate being high enough.
Do you know the sampling rate on the ear clips?
I do not.
Okay.
I'd have to look that up. But if it is from HeartMath, I would assume that they know the data.
Yep.
Would put something out that was at the very least 256 hertz.
You would hope so. Yeah. So I found it easy. You can use the phone sensor with Elite HRV, but since I own one of these and I find it pretty easy to use, like just from my own experience, because I tried the phone app one morning because I was just curious, the phone camera, and just like laying in bed, just being able to put the ear clip on and just do the 2-minute reading, like laying on my pillow versus trying to hold my finger over the phone. I have to say, I feel like having a sensor is way better than trying to do the phone.
I agree with you. I don't like holding my finger there. Even if it's the comfortable position, it starts to get awkward after a while.
Yeah, it's kind of clumsy, right?
With the ear sensor, most important thing, just I guess with the finger sensor as well, is making sure that you are still, because an artifact is the biggest thing when it comes to those optical sensors.
Okay, that's good. Good. Yeah. So, and I'm aware of time and just wanting to be sensitive to your time. So, this is super helpful to have you go through all of that and how to do an RF assessment. And well, I guess that maybe the place to close is, okay, I did my RF assessment. What do I do with that? And what do you recommend to your clients, your patients for resonant frequency breathing?
The research shows that it takes 20 minutes twice a day to start to balance the autonomic nervous system and start to bring more strength and resiliency to it. And of course, over time, you can certainly increase your HRV metrics. You can increase SDNN, you can increase RMSSD, those time domain measurements. That is possible just with resonance frequency breathing. So 20 minutes twice a day is typically what I'm recommending for folks that are really struggling and that are super motivated. They're breathing 3 times a day, usually 20 minutes.
Yeah, it's interesting. I heard one of the doctor advisors for Elite HRV, I heard her on a podcast, and she said, yeah, because she was asked about this 20 minutes 2 times a day. And, does it have to be 20 minutes? What if it's, 15 minutes twice a day? And she said, yeah, I actually tested that out with a client and it was amazing. She said, I did not get nearly the results with this either half time or 3/4 time. And the client actually realized the benefit and, then went to the 20 minutes a day and was like, nope, it's totally worth it. So for those people out there who think you might want to cut corners, there's even some data that shows the cutting corners doesn't really cut it. Is that your opinion?
Absolutely. Leah is a colleague of mine. She is fantastic. She's in New York. And to work with her, you have to basically promise that you're going to do your practice 20 minutes twice a day. Otherwise, she will not work with you.
Okay, there you go. Well, that says it, doesn't it? I mean, that
this is great. But yes, absolutely. There are some docs that say, oh, just start out with 5 minutes, start out with 10. I mean, it's challenging for a lot of people, especially with very busy, active lifestyles, to even find 20 minutes once a day.
Yeah.
but it's there. You can find it. It's just looking at your values and priorities and seeing, how do I fit this in?
And for people who commit to that, what do they discover? Like, do they find life-changing benefits from doing this practice?
Yeah, well, it really depends on what they're coming in with, right? But there are some things, I think, just broadly across the board that folks notice. They're certainly more at ease. They're more calm, more relaxed. They're not getting activated by the things that they would normally get activated about. So the way in which they're being, I think, is differently. They're certainly sleeping better.
Yeah.
That's across the board with almost everybody. So yeah, and the way that I talk about it is that, our nervous system is the master controller. It's the central processing unit of everything. So, if there's chaos going on up here, there's going to be chaos down the rest of the chain into every other organ system, our endocrine system, our musculoskeletal system, everything will be impacted. And so, our bowels can change. Everything, every system of the body can change if we're starting to balance the nervous system and really make it stronger and more resilient.
So one last final question. I feel like I've seen this before, but I'm curious about the link between resonance frequency breathing and meditation. And I feel like I've seen that those things have been linked. And I guess I will say that in my own personal experience, I don't resonance frequency breathe 20 minutes 2 times a day, but I meditate 2 hours a day and have done so for the past 2 years. And what I have found are the same exact benefits that you're describing, like incredible calm, incredible non-reactivity, like a fundamental shift in my being and from meditation. And there can't not be a link there. I mean, there just has to be. I mean, I definitely know I'm breathing this sort of deeper, longer inhales because I am purposefully doing that. I'm just not tracking that breathing. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely, yeah. So what you're 100% on the nose there. Like, while you're not consciously aware of your breath, you are sitting in silence. You're becoming more quiet. So the body is becoming more quiet. And so just naturally, the breath rate is going to start to decrease. There's been some studies on this, and it's been different forms of meditation, and even praying. So folks that pray the rosary, for example, found that they were breathing at 6 breaths per minute. They're roughly breathing at 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out. So yes, I certainly do think that there is a connection there. And I think that it has to do with transitioning into that parasympathetic nervous system more often.
Mm-hmm. And I actually am in my meditative practices and some of the ones that I teach, we do like a 6-minute breath very consciously. It's just that we're not breathing at the optimal. And I've never measured to see what my optimal is, but I'm definitely doing this slower breathing, actually consciously. And then it kind of drops out. Usually the practice is kind of a conscious longer breath and then dropping into more of a just awareness state.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. So clearly they're linked. I'm kind of curious about the significance of finding the resonance frequency and the optimalness of it and the links between that. And people talk about, Kundalini and, accessing these sort of more altered states of consciousness through kind of finding your resonant frequency breath. So I'm kind of curious how important that is, but that sort of wades into the waters of more a finer nuance on this.
Meditation, the breath certainly gets very slow
Mm-hmm.
in meditations, and in some practitioners are breathing only 2 breaths a minute.
Right. Right.
Which is
Really, really slow.
really slow. That would certainly be in the very low frequency range, which, given what we know, is not an optimal cardiovascular state to be in. So some things don't quite match up with the heart rate variability stuff.
Right.
But like I said, I think it's more so just sitting in that silence and getting the body even more and more quiet. That's what's having the biggest impact. And then, like before we even jumped on, we were talking about some of the more subtle energies of the body that we don't quite understand yet, and we can't really quite measure yet. Like, this is one of the best things that we have to kind of measure some of those electrical states like you were talking about. But there's certainly much more to human beings and consciousness than what we know.
Yep. Yep. There's a lot left to be understood. I would agree with you, especially that super slow breathing. There's like this higher HRV isn't necessarily always better, clearly, or people aren't optimizing it, but reaping some other really important benefits in terms of subtle energies. So, yeah. So areas to be further understood, at least in a Western science context, of how that's all linked together. Yeah, cool. Well, I've learned a ton walking through this with you, and really appreciate it. And I know that there are a number of people in the community who've, would like to understand this. So really appreciate you sharing all your wisdom on this and setting the record straight. Thank you so much.
Really happy to. Thanks, Holly.
Yeah, you bet. And thanks everybody who's joined us. Dr. Smith, if people want to get in touch with you, and you're on the community, but what are some other ways they can get in touch with you?
Yeah, you can friend me in the group and go to my page, which is ASO Natural Medicine. My website, which is asonaturalmedicine.com. That's ACESO Natural Medicine. Yeah, that would probably be the best way to get in touch with me.
Great.
The email is asonaturalmedicine@gmail.
Okay.
So just add.
Fantastic. And I'll put that in the show notes too for people. So, all right. Well, have a great evening, everybody, or morning, wherever you are in the world, whenever you are listening. And thanks again. Be well.
Yeah. Thank you.